wanted to dive into is a little bit of the facts and figures around disability and inclusion, because I'm kind of a numbers gal, and I'm glad to hear there's a lot of educators in the room. There's a lot of people who work with numbers probably on a daily basis, and I think numbers really reinforce some of the messages. We can't deny numbers. Numbers are facts. So before I dive into some of the facts and figures that I have around inclusion, let's talk about the prevalence of disability in Victoria, BC. Previously, I mentioned that RMV, we support around 1,200 individuals a year. That sounds like a lot of people, but actually, there are several studies that show that around 16 to 18% of the population have a disability. Does anyone know what the population of the Capital Regional District is?
368,000.
Yes. Yes. Oh my gosh. Okay. I thought maybe that would stump you guys a little bit more. So I'm just going to go with a rough figure of 363 because that was the most recent poll that I found, but 368 is probably more accurate. So if we apply that 16 to 18% to that figure, that's roughly 61,000 individuals in the Capital Regional District alone. And that's individuals all types of disabilities. So 1,200 sounds like a lot. 61,000 is a lot. Often people think that's a very small minority. Well, it definitely beats out the French Canadians that are in Victoria, which is only roughly 5,600 apparently. In 2012, Stats Canada conducted a survey on disability. And what they determined was the number now bumps up from 16% to 33% when we're talking about older Canadians. So in the case of this study, that was individuals over the age of 65. Now I'm pretty new to Victoria, but I've been told by a lot of individuals who live here that this is kind of the mecca for seniors in retirement. And so we know that in Victoria, even though our numbers give us a figure of approximately 61,000, that when it comes to age-related disabilities such as mobility challenges, vision and hearing impairments, neurological and degenerative diseases, that number is going to be much higher locally. The Rick Hansen Foundation estimates that in 20 years, 1 in 5 Canadians will have a disability of some kind. At the moment, 1 in 4 individuals with disabilities are classified as having a severe disability. And so what that means is that several aspects of daily living are significantly impacted. 8 out of 10 persons with disabilities use an aid or an assistive device, which also contributes to some of the negative stigma around invisible disabilities because we are used to seeing most individuals with disabilities having a visual identifier of their disability. The Rick Hansen Foundation also refers to people with disabilities as the world's biggest minority that anyone can become a part of at any time. And I think that contributes to our curiosity and why we're compelled to maybe ask questions about stories when it's pertaining to an acquired disability. Because in the back of our minds, we sort of know that this can happen to anyone at any point in time in their lives. Disability does not simply include the ones that we can see. So I think something that's really important to note is there are lots of disabilities that we do not see, such as autism and mental health illness, which are on the rise. Does anyone know the current statistics on diagnosis of autism in young children at the moment? Anyone want to take a guess?
I don't know, but I know it's pretty high. I think the numbers are rising.
Absolutely. So the most recent surveys tell us that 1 in 68 children are diagnosed as being on the autism spectrum. That's a 100% increase over the last 10 years. The Canadian Mental Health Association states that almost 1 in 2 individuals will experience some form of mental illness throughout their lifetime. So this could be bipolar disorder, depression, anxiety, an eating disorder, work-related mental health illness. The list goes on, but they're certainly alarming statistics, and so it is important for us to take note of these. The Center for Justice and Social Compassion estimates that 45% of all people experiencing homelessness have some form of mental health illness. I actually think that that's a lower estimate because it's really difficult to get accurate numbers when it's pertaining to homelessness. Brain Injury Canada indicates that the incidence and prevalence of brain injury, whether it's an acquired brain injury or a congenital brain injury, outnumbers breast cancer, spinal cord injury, multiple sclerosis, and HIV/AIDS combined. So that's a really surprising statistic, and I think that's certainly a group that a lot of stigma when they're out and about in the community. Let's talk about what that means for our society in Canada. Jackie mentioned it earlier. We are very lucky to be in a country where people are treated quite differently than some of the more impoverished countries, but people with disabilities in Canada are still incredibly marginalized. I've pulled out 3 major sort of issues that I've identified. Employment is a major issue for people with disabilities. A 2012 study by the Canadian Human Rights Commission determined that only half of people with disabilities were employed in the last year. While it is certainly true that many individuals cannot participate in the paid workforce, there are still many others that can and would really love to. They're typically prevented from doing so by barriers and assumptions. We talked about negative attitudes, so especially in the HR departments or in the hiring committees. Mostly applicants are either very reluctant to disclose the nature of their disabilities or share what kind of accommodations they might need with hiring managers, because the answer is typically no quite quickly, or a list of all the reasons why this is not possible is shared. Out of curiosity, how many individuals have ever worked in an environment with a person with a disability, whether it was a staff, a supervisor? That's wonderful. That's, 3 or 5. Okay, that's really good. The current statistics are quite a bit lower. So a BMO Financial Group survey found that few businesses, this was in 2013 that they conducted this survey, only about 3 out of 10 businesses had an employee with a disability. 69% of businesses had never hired someone with a disability before. And even though most businesses that had hired someone with a disability described their employees as meeting or exceeding their expectations, needing fewer accommodations than initially anticipated, and less turnover in those positions, it's still something that is a huge barrier for individuals. At RIV, we've had an employee that's been there for 26 years with a disability, so we're very proud of that. And we've recently hired a student with a mild traumatic brain injury and a student on the autism spectrum. So we like to think that we're very inclusive. Challenges with employment can often lead to an impoverished lifestyle. So if you're not able to retain meaningful and sustainable employment, it's going to be very difficult to provide the necessities of life. According to a recent IRIS report, the IRIS is the Institute for Research on Inclusion and Society, people living with disabilities are twice as likely to live below the poverty line, and there is limited availability of accessible and supporting housing options. Employment and income are critical aspects to daily living, but sport, recreation, and leisure opportunities are also something, the 3rd thing that I've identified as a barrier, or something that's difficult to get involved in. We were talking about overall health and well-being, social connectedness, being part of sport and groups lead to increased self-esteem, new skills that you've developed, and ultimately higher employability. So typically developing children, 30% of them are involved in organized sports in Canada. Anyone want to take a guess as to what children with disabilities, their participation rate might be?
5%.
Very close. It's actually 3%. So there's a huge disparity there. There's a very big gap that definitely needs to be closed, because sport contributes to social connectedness, and you acquire new support groups, and you network in the community when you're involved in sport and recreation. And recreation also encompasses leisure activities as well. So attending a museum, being part of arts programs, music, that's all encompassed in recreation. The cost of inactivity is very high, so escalating medical conditions, social isolation, and many others. So the big question, what is inclusion? In the simplest form, it's the act of being included. There is a distinction to make between accessibility and inclusion. Accessibility very much pertains to the physical environment. Inclusion is very much related to the social environment and our attitudes. So a place could be accessible, a facility could be accessible, but perhaps doesn't demonstrate inclusive values, and vice versa. So it is important to address both of them. I like to think that inclusion, it means that all individuals can participate and that everyone is being included. Some limitations to inclusion are practical, so staffing, training, equipment, and capacity, but others are less tangible, such as public awareness and societal shifts in thinking. The benefits of inclusion, so it's important to remember that there are several benefits to inclusion. And I've sort of named a couple of the ones that are directly beneficial to the individual, but I think that it's important to remember that there are a lot of secondary benefits to other populations in our society. So when we're including individuals with disabilities, we're becoming more welcoming and inclusive to people with language barriers, first-generation immigrants, maybe tourists from the cruise ships who have difficulty with wayfinding, or the cultural differences are very obvious. First Nations populations, individuals from low socioeconomic status. So there are tremendous ripple effects outwards into the community as well. Lastly, all I want to say about inclusion, and I hope that I blazed through that really quickly because we only have 10 minutes left, but the last thing I want to say about inclusion is that it's not rocket science, and it sounds like we're in a room with some really creative minds who've already, come up with different ways of accommodating people's needs and welcoming others into the museum environment. So I think we're going to hop into a quick discussion about how we can be more inclusive, and then we really want to provide some time to answer your questions. So hopefully some of those numbers will stick with you.
Yeah, I think it's important to know the range of the numbers, because we assume that it's less than it is because of the invisibility. And that's not just invisible disabilities, that's because of barriers to people participating in the community. And so you just don't see people with disabilities. It's interesting. Does anybody know what the Quasimodo complex is? This is the Hunchback of Notre Dame. Well, the story goes that Quasimodo only fully understands his ugliness when Esmeralda can't look at him without expressing shock. So the Quasimodo complex is that so-called deformed people or people with disabilities read the extent of their abnormality in other people's reactions to them. It's not when you look in the mirror that you think you're a freak or a weirdo. It's when you see other people's reactions to you. And that's where all of us can make a massive difference, is in our demeanour and in our way of reacting to people. And it's very interesting. I saw it this morning. It's a thing called micro-expressions, and people are very, people who've studied this idea of micro-expressions, the idea is that every emotion that you're experiencing yourself can be read on your face by somebody that is experienced in doing that. And they gave some really good examples. There was the example where Lance Armstrong was on Oprah, and he's finally come out and admitted that he was doping all that time when he said he wasn't doping. And he is furious that he has to be there and do this thing. And they actually freeze the frame of his face, and you can see pure fury on his face. Even though he's going, yes, Oprah, no, Oprah, and trying to be very, the facial expression is so powerful. And this is where inclusion is what's written on your face. When somebody comes in, perhaps joins your group to walk around the museum, and you're anxious because you don't know how to handle it, or you're worried about the communication method that you're going to use, or you think there's a display that they might not, that might not be appropriate, or whatever, that anxiety will show on your face. And people with disabilities are just as good as everybody else at picking up micro-expressions as everyone else. So, in fact, probably even more so, because you're so used to having negative reactions or shocked reactions or fearful reactions that you kind of get a bit hypersensitive towards it. And that can be an issue with people with invisible difficulties as well. So, we often say inclusion is customer service. It's just the same. It's about being welcoming, it's about being open, it's about not assuming anything, not assuming that this is going to be a problem, not assuming that this is going to be a bit difficulty, about asking questions about communication methods, for example, and being welcoming, creating a culture of respect. Inclusion is a culture of respect. And everybody does that through the way they talk to people, through the way they interact with people, through the questions that they ask, and the demeanour that they have. And a lot of people we perhaps be working with reception staff, and reception, it will literally happen that somebody will come in with in a wheelchair or with some kind of visible disability in this case, and they will push themselves back from the because they're not sure about it, they don't know how to deal with it, and so they unconsciously put some distance between themselves and the person. And obviously that carries so many messages and gives that can be enough to have someone with a disability can turn around and walk out the door and never come back again. So those kind of very, good customer service and genuine customer service as well, because you can smell a rat a mile away. If you think someone's putting it on for you, going, oh, hello, that kind of over-the-top American customer service, which being a Brit I find a bit weird, but those people who say have a nice day, and you think, you don't care whether I have a nice day or not. Is that me? Probably just me. Probably shouldn't say that. I'm in North America, should probably think that they're being genuine. But anyway. So this idea of the Quasimodo complex is that I'm not weird until you think I'm weird. And that actually, people talk about disability and how you define disability, and it's such a wide range of conditions and people, which is true. But that is one thing that doesn't change, is that we are defined by other people's reaction to us. So that's this idea of the Quasimodo complex. So you kind of have to do, again, it's a bit of self-examination. Am I behaving differently because this person has a disability? Am I being more over the top with them than I would normally, or am I being less? Have I asked obvious, simple questions like how would you best like to communicate, or have I tried to ignore them and pretend they're not there? Because we talk a lot about first involvement in disability inclusion, and it's very, very easy to put a person with disabilities off. It's very, very, if they have a bad customer service experience, you won't get them back on it. Because you think about the complications they've had to get there in the first place, it's too much. If you're going to have somebody who's going to be snotty with you when you get there, then you won't go back. So inclusion starts with your response to disability, and that's why we've been talking about all these fears and anxieties and prejudices and stigmas and stereotypes that come with it, because we have to start to expose them. However, it's actually really nice because you can get rid of all that with a smile. It doesn't take much. You don't have to say the right thing, use the right language, know the exact adaptive activity that's with this person. All you have to do is have a genuine smile and not be frightened. Expose your own fears so that you don't have a micro expression when somebody with a disability appears in your group. It's the simplest thing in the world. It's just to be welcoming. Say, how can I help you? Is there anything I can do to make this easier for you? Very, very simple, very basic customer service. But coming from the heart and being genuine, and that is inclusion. That's it. That's how it works. And starting the conversation, which is, we've been doing in this room for the last couple of hours, is starting this conversation. It doesn't just stop when we walk out of the room, and it doesn't just stop when perhaps we'll provide you with some materials when we finish making them. They're not done yet, but I'll show you some drafts in a minute. It starts with a conversation. It starts with you talking to each other, talking to your families, talking to your friends about your own reactions to disabilities, your own fears, your own worries about it, or your own aims and joys. You might really want to do a display on disability in the museum. You may really want to target a particular group in the community who you think are underrepresented here, and you would like to bring them in, and you'd like to do something to work with them. There are so many positive things that can be done using these very simple tools. So we talked a lot about attitudes, and attitudes are influenced by, attitudes are something we don't generally think about. Where do our attitudes come from? But here we go. Attitudes are influenced by questioning yourself. Are your attitudes fixed? Where do they come from? A lot of people will inherit them from their families without having thought about it. I mean, language is always, people always talk about what language do I use, and people get very hooked up on that. Actually, it's not, that when you're printing published material or stuff on a website, yes, there are guidelines on the right words to use. Generally, people don't worry about it too much because they know good intent when they see it. Most people of a certain generation will say handicapped, even though handicapped isn't really a word that people like too much. And the reason for that is because it comes from cap in hand, it comes from begging. It comes from people who went out and you know, with a crutch or a visible disability, and they begged with a cap. And that's where the word handicap, and that's why that negative association is why people with disabilities don't particularly like it. However, John and I went to do a talk at a ladies' luncheon group when we came back from Rio, and they talked about the handicap, and you can tell that that's just their generation, it's just what their grandma had said or whatever. You know, we're not going to get offended by that. Like, we actually are growing up sometimes, some of the time. But questioning, where does it come from? You know, like, and obviously insulting words like retarded and things like that, you know, which are, you know, so out of date. Attitudes are influenced by your personal experience, and I've given you some examples on there. If we'd have a bit more time, we would share that, but I'd encourage you to share those experiences. Research has shown over and over and over again that these attitudes, these fears, dissolve with personal contact. So when you work with people with disabilities, when you work with community groups with disabilities, when you invite them into your homes and your museums, your communities, magic happens. And those fears and anxieties dissolve away because you don't treat them as a child with cerebral palsy. You treat them as John, who's really, really interested in shells and wants to start drawing them and wants me to help them do that. You know, so those personal experiences are the way to change it. In fact, it's been proved that a government advertising campaign is less effective than a school and community-based approach because it's one-to-one. It's me meeting this child, it's you meeting this lady, and then working with them on an individual basis that changes things. The government could advertise till they're blue in the face and spend $1 million every time, and it would have less influence than one person in your museum having a good experience and telling their friend, hey, you should go down to the museum and have this really good scheme, you can do this. You know, networking is very important. And we really hope with our project that all of you will be able to go away and spread the net a little bit, because that's how things change. Okay? Positive reinforcement, positive images, we've talked about that and shown some good examples of that. Social learning, doing things together. So the museum's a perfect environment for that kind of thing. You know, you can have groups, community groups coming into the museum, interacting with your materials and your objects and your displays and learning together, including the people at the museum learning. Observation. You know, when you observe people with disabilities, try not to do it with anything already in your mind about how blind people will react, or how people with mental illness will react, or how children with autism in the autism spectrum. Don't bring no assumptions to the table. Observe, and then you can respond. And again, we've had some good examples in this group of how people have already done that in their work. You know, they've had a group of somebody who's come to the museum with a disability. They don't know the answer, but they've been able to adapt through observation of that person and how that person is interacting. And learning through association. So contact. It's the biggest way that we dissolve these barriers. It's the biggest way that we move forward. And so that's why we're so kind of passionate about this idea of people with disabilities being included in social and recreational contexts, because then everybody learns and the fears start disappearing. I'm just going to skip past these to my next one. Who said this? Diversity is Canada's strength, where everyone can reach their potential, which benefits the whole community. We are who we are precisely because we are open, diverse and inclusive. Yes, of course. The Prime Minister says it, we've got to believe it. But I think Trudeau has been a very good exemplar in that respect, because he's not trying to divide. And that's happening in so many places across the world, and none of us need any more examples of that. But Trudeau is taking the opposite approach, saying we're strong because we're different. And so the disabled people in our community are part of our strength. And that's what one of the messages that we're trying to get across to you. So these are the ways to tackle attitudes, the ways to think about it. And they aren't, we're not going to have earth-shattering changes, but we are going to have meaningful one-to-one contacts with people that make a difference to them, particularly because of all the benefits that social inclusion brings to people with disabilities, but also to you, because you learn and you grow and you understand and you're doing it with no preconceptions. You know, that's the biggest problem with people with disabilities when you walk into a room, is that you bring a whole big cloud of preconceptions with you. And we spend all our lives trying to back them away. Leave me alone, I'm just me, okay? So that's it. So we are, as part of this project, we are producing some training materials, which we hope to be very sort of clear and simple ways you can start managing some of these issues within your facility. These aren't finished. So you know, the text is pretty much right, but some of the design and stuff we are still working on. But this gives you some signposts: attitudes, access, choices, communications, policies, opportunities. So sort of fronts to tackle the process on. And obviously we'll make sure you get these materials when they're properly finished and done. But we talked about attitudes mostly today: negative attitudes, be welcoming and willing, change habits, routines and assumptions. You know, if you can, next time you meet a person with a disability in the museum, if you can just try not to have any assumptions about them, then you're stepping forward in a way that, how would you say, 99.9% of people aren't? Kind of thing. Choices: ask how people would like to participate, consult with community groups, and identify gaps in provision. Has the museum had an audit by wheelchair users? That would be interesting to know, whether it's actually being audited by people who use wheelchair. Be interesting to know whether that's been done. I mean, I know that the accessibility is generally reasonable, but you don't know until you ask a wheelchair user to do it. You would be amazed at how many facilities have their accessibility audit done by people who don't use wheelchairs. So it's staggeringly common. Signage and communications, as Amie pointed out, that's not just good for people with disabilities, it's good for all your visitors to have clear signage, to understand the way to move through this space. Very, very important. Culture of respect is part of access. So, you know, these are kind of, it's all kind of bullet point training, but it's the way to get started, and the material will be supported by more comprehensive material for managers and stuff. So, what do you think of my yellow? I've moved forward with this. So the anatomy of best practice, customer service, we talked about that, engage with the person with not the disability. So that's a very important point. You know, this is a person who's walked into your museum. You know, there is a lot more to them than just their disability, and people get very kind of deer in the headlights and get hooked on the disability and kind of freaky about it. And it's actually not about that at all. It's like the person that's come to the museum because they want to go to the Terry Fox exhibition. You know, they haven't come to the museum to have a discussion about their disability. So, you know, these kind of person first, be positive and respectful, be creative, include by including. Inclusion starts with one step. And we hope that today is a big step within your facility. And then I'm at the moment putting together these sort of frequently asked questions that people ask about. What should I do if I feel uncomfortable? Sometimes find it difficult to understand the speech. I don't know how to adapt my activity. These kind of practical approaches towards some of the issues, and perhaps they will be in some of those will come that are specific to the museum will come up in our questions that we've had here. So, so I think that's pretty much it.
Those seem like
and anonymous questions.
those seem like great resources.
Pardon?
Those seem like really great resources.
That's what we wanted to do, was try and make it them clear and simple, so you can have them on reception, you know, those kind of things.
Orientation pack.
Or orientation packs, or for people who have like lots of volunteers, or they have lots of temporary staff, for example. You know, so they're very. And if there's specific issues to do with specific disabilities, then the managers get more information and they can kind of use that to aid, give the staff the guidance that they need. So, but we want to have stuff that's very user-friendly, to use a not very nice expression. I'm being snotty about my English here now, but so I think. I mean, the only other thing that I really wanted, we'll go through some anonymous questions, but also I kind of I like to bring it back to Terry, really. I think I did bring it back to Terry then. Yes. I did bring it back to Terry. So why Terry matters? And I mean, a lot of it is because of what we've been talking about the negative attitudes. And Terry Fox is not a negative image of disability. In fact, Terry Fox is a national hero in a country that's 5,000 miles wide and has a huge amount of diversity in it. And you know, he is actually one of the people that drew this country together in many ways. Many people would say that because of his huge ambition to run across Canada. But I mean, some of the reasons he matters to me. Did you know that 200 people wrote songs for Terry Fox? They sent them to him on homemade cassettes held together with masking tape. Canadian rock stars Rush gave him their gold disc of Permanent Waves. Didn't know that. He was deluged with mail, more mail than the whole town of Port Coquitlam received at Christmas. When he went back after he got sick in Thunder Bay and he went back home to BC. A mountain, 14 schools, an icebreaker and 32 roads have been named after him. There are at least 7 Terry Fox memorials. To this day, he's cited by Canadian athletes, both disabled and able-bodied, as their inspiration. Basketball player Steve Nash was 6 years old when the Marathon of Hope started and says that seeing Terry inspired me for the rest of my life. Rick Hansen, who completed his Man in Motion wheelchair circumnavigation of the globe in 1987, carried a small statue of Terry given to him by the Fox family. But when he entered his first serious run of 17 miles in Prince George, some people were shocked that a person with one leg would enter. Back then, people with disabilities hardly entered the public sphere. Being disabled meant being invisible, but Terry wasn't having that. And a huge part of his legacy is that he got out there challenging attitudes by this simple act of moving through the world. So those are just a few reasons why Terry matters to me. The objects thing fascinates me because we're in a museum, and that's what people do in museums. They use objects to tell stories and to explain things. And Amie and I haven't yet had the pleasure of seeing the exhibition, but we will, and I can't wait to see what you've got up there through his stuff. But I was truly fascinated when I read Douglas Copeland's book about Terry Fox, about his holy, as I mentioned before, his holy tracksuits, his chemo curly hair. That's another thing that I have in common with him, because my hair fell out after my accident, and then when it grew back curly because it was straight before. And it's the same with Terry. He had straight hair until after his chemo, and then when it grew back, and he's so known and so famous for his beautiful curls. So I was like, Terry's got curly hair like me. So yes, and there's lots of other Terry Fox stuff I've got here, but you know, he is seen as a hero, but he's also the boy next door. And I mean, I think that's a very good metaphor for disability. You know, you can have the people with disabilities who do heroic things like Terry, but really they're just your own sister and your own brother. And ordinary but extraordinary, which again, I think somebody used that example very early on in this session. So thank you all very much. And Amie will lead a few questions.
We're going to do some, well, if anyone has questions of their own, but I'll kind of quickly scan through the questions and pull out some that are pertinent to this session. And then simply before we leave, I'll pass around a little survey form, and if I can get you all to provide some feedback to us so we can tweak it as we go in the future. And it is anonymous as well. But, alright, let's start with some questions. This one was about asking about a person's story, so whether, like, how they became disabled. We kind of discussed that. How does a disability affect one's energy level, Jackie?
Well, I think for my energy level, for me to walk takes, I think it's like yours plus 2/3 or something like that, just to walk, or maybe twice, I think, close to that. But yes, it's a big issue, definitely, for everyone with a disability, because there's bits that don't work, so you're having to use other bits to make to do what you normally do. Obviously, some conditions are much more debilitating in terms of energy levels, but those of us who work with people with disabilities often will incorporate that into our workshops, for example, there'll be more comfort breaks and there'll be time for people just to take some time out. And, you know, perhaps sporting activities will be done in smaller times sections. You know, you won't go for half an hour, you'll go for 20 minutes, that kind of thing. Again, very simple changes and adaptations, but you're just making sure that you're keeping the person engaged, because if they get too tired, then they'll just cut out and not be engaged anymore.
This one's a good one here. Are kids the cruelest people you have to deal with? Because they're very curious and honest.
Well, that's a very interesting question, because it happens, again, almost on a daily basis with me. I don't wear my prosthesis a lot because I have some issues with my residual limb. So I take my dog for a walk every day on my crutches, and every day there'll be small children running along going, "Mummy, she's only got one leg." And there's a cut-off age, like my nieces and nephews all stopped asking once. They didn't ask at all till they were about between 2 and 3. I think it's when the ego starts to develop, when they start to understand that they're separate from the rest of the world. They start to realise, and then they go, "Oh, this person's not normal," or not normal. And it's, again, very interesting. There does seem to be a sort of impression of what a body should look like that we're born with, and like a vision of it. So they recognise straight away when something doesn't fit into that. Between 2 and 3. I don't mind too much with kids. What I do mind is when the parents go, "Shh," and start shushing them and like admonishing, because I don't want it to be a banned conversation. I want them to be able to come up and go, "Hey, yeah," you know. And I often use the dog to do that. And I say, "Would you like to come over and say hi to my dog?" And then they get more interested in the dog than me, which is great, you know. So I like to engage them and not just have it as a shock, horror, gore point moment. I like to try, if the kids are going to make comments, then you can come over and speak to me. And then, you know, perhaps we can normalise it a little bit then, because as soon as they hear you speak and engage, then it changes.
Yeah.
So but yes, and children with developmental difficulties, the age group goes way up, so it'll often be kids who are, you know, teenagers who still, I was a volunteer on one of the tour ships, the Pacific Swift last year, or Pacific Grace actually, which is, there was a kid there who was a teenager who literally 10 times a day would go, "But you've only got one leg, but you've only got one leg," like over and over again. Like it was just too much for him to not comment. He couldn't, you know, and obviously that's an issue with his disability, and you know, that's fine. But I still like to engage past that and go, "Yeah, but I do this as well," and you know, to extend it, like not just to get hooked on that one thing. I do try, even in that situation. I'm probably harder than most people about it.
I've just read through the questions very quickly, and I know that we're over time.
Yeah,
and
we
I
are,
saw
yeah.
there's a lot of questions with that are very specific to accommodations. So I think what we'll do is we'll take your questions and we'll actually formulate a follow-up response with some practical solutions.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot in here that are very good questions and very pertinent to the populations that you're working
Okay.
with.
Yeah, we'll do that. That's
And
easy.
if there's questions for Jackie about this presentation, maybe we can do that, and then we'll break, because
Yeah, I know.
respect your time as well that you allocated.
Yeah.
So are there any questions specific to the presentation and the information that Jackie presented?
I missed your fact on the autism 1 in what?
1 in 68, and that's
68.
from Autism Speaks Canada.
Thank you.
I'll pass these around if you have any questions.
Yes, but thank you very much for all your time and attention. It's been a pleasure. And, you know, we really welcome the opportunity to answer your specific questions, don't we? Because, you know, we know that we have the understanding and the resources to be able to help with that. So, we're really happy to be able to spread that around.
Yeah. And these are not questions that are unique to this facility either. Yeah. Well, thank you guys.
Well, thank you so much, the two of you.